Hi, and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series and our panel on men's lives in poetry. My name is Suzanne Parker. I'm an instructor here at Brookdale, and I am also the co-director of the Brookdale Writers Conference, which will be on April 29th and 30th, 2005. With me is my colleague, Michael Broek, who is also an instructor in the English department and who is also a co-director of the Brookdale Writers Conference. We have with us today a studio panel made up of guests and students, and in the third part of our show, we'll be opening up the discussion for questions from our studio audience. Today we have four wonderful poets who are going to be discussing what it means to be a man who is writing poetry in today's society. So to begin, we would like to introduce our four guests. First off, we have Pat Rosal, who is the author of Uprock, Headspin, Scramble, and Dive, and the chapbook Uncommon Denominators, which won the Palanquin Poetry Series Award. In addition to numerous honors and other publications in journals and anthologies, Pat has collaborated with painters, composers, and the dance company at Penn State Altoona. He was also the 2001 Emerging Writer in Residence at Penn State, and he teaches now at Bloomfield College in New Jersey. Welcome.
Thanks.
Second, I'd like to introduce Charles Lynch. Charles is an assistant professor of English at New Jersey City University. He's published essays, articles, and reviews in a wide variety of publications, including The Black Scholar, Myths, the Before Columbus Review, First World, and many others. And his poems have been anthologized in the Poetry of Black America and Celebrations, and have appeared in the journals Chelsea, Hanging Loose, Radipalix, Crab Orchard Review, and many, many others. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you.
We also have Patrick Donnelly, whose first collection of poems was published in 2003 and is called The Charge. He holds an MFA from Warren Wilson College, where he received the Larry Levis Scholarship. Patrick's poems have been featured on Poetry Daily, Verse Daily, and have been published in many journals and anthologies. He has received fellowships and grants from the Breadloaf Writers Conference and from the Penn Fund for Writers. He also ran the two extremely popular New York City reading series, one at the Ear Inn and the other at the Bowery Poetry Club. Welcome.
Thank you.
Peter Murphy is a teacher, essayist, and poet, and has received many awards, including from the New Jersey State Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the White House Commission on Presidential Scholars. His first book of poems, Stubborn Child, is forthcoming from Jane Street Press in January. He's also the founder and director of the Winter Poetry and Prose Getaway, held annually in Cape May, and he's a consultant to the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation's poetry program. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Michael.
We thought we'd start today by asking each of our panelists a guest about their work, and if anybody would like to jump in, please do so. Okay, so Pat, we thought we'd start with you. You say that you were surrounded mainly by men in your life, by your father, your brothers, your friends were men as well. And when I look at your poetry, much of the poetry seems to include situations where men are finding out who they are as men, where they're figuring out how they fit inside male culture. And I was wondering, do you think there is an idea about masculinity that you are exploring in your work? And do you think that this is an important process for a male poet to go through?
You know, I think it's like a lot of things in poetry. I think that you're not looking, or I'm not looking to explore anything in particular. It's something that just kind of arises out of my own inner conflicts. And one of them definitely was about, you know, gender roles. One of them is growing up Asian American in northern Jersey, when there weren't a whole lot of Filipinos there. And, you know, during that time, there's just this overwhelming amount of Asian American men, images of Asian American men in the media and in film, and were essentially emasculated. And so there's this pendulum reaction in my generation of Asian American men to go to super macho, and there's got to be somewhere in between. And I think that tension, that struggle between those two extremes, is where I think that my poetry tries to reside. It explores all the foibles of being kind of this, you know, super macho and buying into all of the typical, stereotypical ideas of what a man should be, and what causes that, and where we end up because of that.
Yeah, I can see that actually, because a lot of your poems really do address sort of a hyper masculinity. and the speakers and the voices in them are trying to figure out how to work inside that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Peter, you had put together an artistic statement for today. In fact, all our panelists did. And in that statement, you said that men often end up on top, or at least that was a line from a Janis Joplin song, I think.
Yeah.
And you said, how sad.
Yeah.
But it left me wondering, how sad for whom? For the men or for the women? And I wonder if it's something of both. In your poem, Artiste, you have a male speaker who seems to be very angry and driven. And even if he's up on top in the hierarchy of society, he certainly doesn't seem to be a fulfilled person. So when you think of this, of hierarchy in America today, in gender roles, the fact that the man, you say, is on top and that's sad, who is it sad for? Is it sad just for the man? Is it sad for the woman? And how would it be sad for?
Well, I hadn't thought of it in quite that way, but if this were a judge, that would be a leading question, Michael. I think women have always been, hurt by men. I mean, women sort of hurt each other, but men have hurt women far more. And I guess it's true that if one person is keeping another down, he's also keeping himself down. I think there's a history in our country of doing that as well. The image that comes to mind is of a bird with two wings that flies, right? Men and women. A bird with one wing is just going to go around in circles or crash. I think as far as men being on top, literally on top, figuratively on top as well, but I think men have just hurt a lot of women. Men have hurt women too often. And I think that's something I've been becoming more sensitive to as I mature. Maybe when I grow up, I'll have a better sense of it.
In that particular poem, the man seems to be the person in control, in power, and he seems to feel very alone, too. Does this idea of being on top, even if they are the ones doing the oppressing, is that a lonely, hurtful position for the man as well?
It's power. In the poem, there's this man who's punching nails into his driveway, and not quite sure why, and he's naming each nail after a member of his family, his wife nail, his daughter nail, and his son nail, and he runs out of names and keeps punching them. And then it turns, the poem turns so that he's sitting in a driveway waiting for his wife to return, and he has a bottle of whiskey and a gun in his lap. And so he's angry, and he is on top, but he's maybe has the gun in order to keep, whatever reason for his imagined insult from the wife that he's doing this, he's trying to hold on to power, and maybe the wife has finally left. And therefore he's powerless over this. He'll have to find a new family to abuse. But he's got the gun, he's got his whiskey. It's a stereotype, but it's one that I think happens all too often. You don't see women becoming mass murderers in post offices and other things. It's always men.
Is this a theme you find you go back to in your work?
Yeah, I realized that more and more I've been writing about women. I've been writing from the point of view of women in a number of poems. Women who are longing, and what they're longing for in many cases is a man who won't hurt them, maybe a man who'll support them. I first wrote a poem like this maybe 15 years ago, and I didn't understand it. I thought, oh my gosh, does this mean I'm homosexual? And because I'm writing in a point of view women, and more as I'm doing it, I'm becoming more comfortable with the idea that I guess maybe to better understand, it's a way to, I guess it is a way to understand. Now, was I planning on this? No. As Patrick said, in the universe of writing a poem, things emerge from the subconscious. You have some images that come together. And so it comes out, and I guess I'm interested in it if it keeps coming out.
Can I just say something about what Peter said? One of the things that I relate to that Peter said is the idea that men in trying to oppress, or men in trying to be more powerful than women, are in fact stymieing the possibility of revolutions in world culture. And I think in our country, one of the things that the media perpetuates is the idea of males and females being in competition, and also males having to be macho, or males having to be suspicious, or males having to be brutalizers of females. One reason for that is if females and males do coalesce, if they do learn to trust one another more, we'll have a really different society. We'll have both groups empowered, both groups moving on certain issues, such as daycare, such as the environment, such as all of those things that impact us. Gay and lesbian liberties, the possibility of people loving one another and marrying as they wish. One of the things that I fear greatly is poetry is being used very often in the rap scene or hip-hop scene at times to disenfranchise men and women, and young people often aren't aware of that.
Yeah.
That makes me think, Patrick, in some of your work, or at least in your artistic statement, you mentioned how poetry shouldn't propagandize, is not a political statement, or often fails when that's the purpose to begin with. And yet, we're also talking here, Charles, you're talking about maybe how poetry can maybe make some of these things happen. I think, how make men and women coalesce or address these issues. Do you find that, Patrick, or anybody in your work, you try to make things happen? Do you write poems that try to make things happen? How? Yeah.
I really don't, except in a very indirect way. W.H. Auden very famously said, "Poetry makes nothing happen."
Right.
But I think it's important that the poem work as words, first of all, and as literature, whatever that is. And then if it fires somebody up to love people more or to act more justly in the world, that is beautiful too. I think maybe the first mechanism through which that happens is greater understanding of how the world is and how people are. That can happen through literature and through all of the arts. I think of Shakespeare, how many dozens of times reading or watching his plays do I think to myself, that's the way people are. He really got that down there. He really understood. Or that's how I've experienced people too.
So it's not telling people to go do a certain thing, but showing them the way the world is, trying to be honest about what's going on, and then they can do with that what they want.
Yeah, and hopefully reflecting back the world in all of its complication, and its nuance, and not giving a black and white version of it that's palatable for one reason or another.
Well, you had talked about in your artistic statement that you've gone through a number of different professions or started a number of different professions as a priest, an opera singer, and a chef. And what I found fascinating about your statement was the idea that these are labeled as unmanly vocations. That it's okay for a boy or a man to be a landscape architect, but it's not okay for a boy to like to garden. That it's okay for a man to be a chef, but it is not okay for a man or a little boy to want to help his mother in the kitchen. And so I found that fascinating, and what I thought was this idea of the unmanly attributes. Is that in conflict with being a male poet? I mean, is the required sensitivity, if there is one, of being a poet, kind of in conflict with this sense of manly pursuits?
I think it is. I think, in a way it's like dance. You have to be brave to kind of go into poetry as a young man, in particular. And also poetry is so marginalized as, a subculture of the bigger world of literature now, that it's not a place where you're going to make a lot of manly money and, drive a big car and everything. So you really have to have, I guess, different values, and you would only do it if you were driven to do it.
Yeah. Charles, you had mentioned in your artistic statement the idea that when you were younger, the only person you shared your poems with was your family. And now you see people, men proudly up there, proclaiming their feelings in their poems.
Yeah. Or people walking down the street talking to themselves because they're reciting someone else's poem. I think that one of the difficulties in American life is that at times a certain provincialism and a fear of showing sensitivity on the part of men prevents us from sharing quite a few things that we create. In other cultures, the role of the poet has often been valued, certainly in places like Russia, certainly in Arabic culture. I don't think anyone would denigrate males at all in Persian culture for writing poetry. But I think that in my past, one of the difficulties was a lot of the people were undereducated. I'm speaking of the black community in Baltimore that I grew up in. Many of the people were undereducated. They feared what they did not know. On one hand, they could recite poems because they knew folk poems. They could certainly sing rhythm and blues. Poetry is embedded in that music, in that tradition. But if you were front and center presenting yourself as a poet, all of a sudden, as Patrick was saying, you are you are threatening what is considered to be a traditional role that a male should assume when I was young. That's changed, and I'm glad it has.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think that raises some really interesting thoughts. And at this moment, I think we're going to take a break, and then we will be back. And at that point, we're going to have some more questions for our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from our studio audience. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.
Poem. It takes a whole lot of sturdy faith, hey. Takes stones in the hole dug deep. Takes a knot in the back and shoulders slumped. Takes a whole lot of fallen trees, dead wood, dry brush. Takes genuflection at black rock. Takes a song in the valley blown. Takes a little sleep and one bad dream to wake up crying, open my eyes and sing, damn. Enough stars up there to pin up the whole black sky. Takes one good breeze. Takes a God with broad hands and a breast soft enough for me to lay my head. Takes prayer. Thank you for dirt. Thank you for stubborn oak roots. Thank you for the triple spring, for the winged shadows circling without a name, for sweat to cool me down. Takes earth and lake, takes the night, takes the slip light by moons, takes fire to warm my feet and a dragon I can't see. Takes a whole lot of faith, sturdy faith. Hey.
My name is Dee Barnett, and I am newly enrolled at the Brookdale Community College campus. Brookdale seems to offer a lot, and I want to take advantage of as much as possible.
Hi, I'm Danielle Speech, graduate of Brookdale Community College 2004, and you're watching Brookdale Television.
Dawn, outskirts of Albuquerque, adobe cafe with terracotta tile roof. Bunk, quit staring. My father pokes my ribs. Turn around, spread this napkin on your lap. I'd never seen a Mexican up close, or thick hair down a woman's back fall below her cheeks. I sulk and fiddle with a fork. Mama points, oh, unsanitary. But please motion for the manager. From my plate's rim, a glossy black strand curls across wheat toast wedges, creases a melting butter pat, vanishes in a glob of raspberry jam. I yearn to pluck up her welcoming gift, bear it through stale smoke and morning's light to arouse delivery guys and truckers nursing coffees along the counter, slyly tracking my waitress bustle about. Marisol! The freckled owner snaps. She hunches, then frowns. He scowls, crooks his finger. I sit stiffly, imitate the elders. Lips pursed, dark almond eyes downcast. Senorita nods apology, bends. Over red and blue check tablecloth, jasmine-scented, ruffled bodice quivers between Dad and me. As the plate whisks above my head, Marisol brushes my shoulder blade. Another strand breaks free, grazes my brow, my nose, my lip, slithers down fringed cowboy shirt and settles upon covered crotch, which suddenly palpitates and swells. Entwined in hair's breadth reverie, I drifted, singed by hunger, rough edge wetted, naked before I came of age.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Writers Series and our panel on men's lives in poetry.
I'd like to ask a question next of Charles. Charles, you and the other poets here have deep senses of spirituality, and yet you each grew up, I'm sure, in different traditions. How have those traditions been important for you and your work? Many of these traditions have very specific ideas about how men should behave, whether it's in the priesthood or whether it's as heads of family or their roles in the church and bringing up their families and so forth. How do you approach spirituality, and does it come up in your work? Is it a lens that you look through?
One of the fortunate facts of being a Baha'i, I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, is that the prophet of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, espouses the idea that a poem is a gift to God and through God. So I'm empowered in that way, regardless of what my subject matter may be, But right now, one of the things I'm trying to do is take some of the spiritual tenets of the faith, such as gender equality, and also the idea that there shouldn't be extremes of wealth or poverty. And I'm trying to write poems that address those. I'm trying to dramatize those ideas. So in that way, I do feel empowered by my faith, and I feel empowered in ways that I was not before I became a Baha'i in around 1990.
Do others of you, is that an issue for you in your lives, and in your poetry in particular?
I think there's something vaguely subversive about a gay guy writing about God, because the gay community is so wounded about organized religion, and gay men in particular are so separated from our spiritual natures. So it's not something I have an agenda about. I'm just working out my own agenda in my poems, but I'm aware that there is some friction there.
My father was a Catholic priest, and he wasn't just any kind of regular Catholic priest. He was a theologian. He was a Thomistic theologian, which means he basically defended the tenets of the church, and he could quote the Summa Theologica in Latin to us when we were misbehaving.
Did it work?
I don't go to church anymore. In any case, I think that what I had associated, right or wrong, with the church was this kind of an idea of a really strict moral life, and I felt kind of very caged in by it. And what literature and poetry and stories did for me was free me from that. I might have gone overboard, and Blake says the path of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. I might have excessively kind of abandoned my ideas of spirituality through the Catholic Church, but it was also through poetry that I discovered another kind of spirituality, kind of opened up many ideas. My metaphor is the remix. I was able to kind of remix all kinds of religious ideas together and to kind of create something that was more true to myself.
I want to ask a question of everybody in general, which is about permissions and about subject matter. When I think about great male poets, I don't often read poems like I've read in some of yours that you gave to us for today about sharing towels in the bathroom, about waiting for your wife to come home. These are subjects that maybe are new to men's poetry in some way. Do you think, either historically, was there a time when permissions opened up for men? Or for you personally, if there's a writer that you found who said, oh, I can write about that. That's something true to my experience that lets me do something new that I hadn't thought of before.
Well, let me say a word or two here. I grew up thinking that poetry was something utterly terrible because of the way it had been taught to me when I was in school. And as I mentioned in my statement, then I discovered that girls like boys who are sensitive. So I started writing very bad love poems and giving them to girls. They would say, oh, you're so sensitive.
Did it work?
No, it didn't. I didn't know what to do next. I was too sensitive. I should have been more aggressive. Been a real man, but no. But I would retype the poem with a different girl's name and different hair color and use it again.
That might have been the problem.
Well, I would always give a clean copy. I called them fill-in-the-blank love poems. It wasn't until I started reading poetry, which unfortunately came too late in my young life. I started reading poetry when I was a senior in high school, and then I realized that everything I had written up until that point, those 200 bad love poems, were just junk. I was influenced at first, I think, by the beat poets, by Allen Ginsberg, Corso, Ferlinghetti, because they were talking about a world that I understood. They were talking about the underside of the life of growing up in New York that was very real to me, and I didn't see that before. I didn't see that in the great bards I was trying to be taught in school. It took a while for me then to go back and discover that, the great bards, those dead white poets, they were pretty good. They also had something to say. I think perhaps in the long run, the biggest influence on me was Wordsworth. I was hitchhiking through the Lake District in England, and I met this shepherd, and he said, what are you? I said, I'm a poet. He said, do you know our poet? I said, no, what's his name? He said, William Wordsworth. Never heard of him. So he directed me 3 miles over to Grassmere, to Wordsworth House. I figured I'd go over and have a talk, and I got nervous because there were signs saying to Wordsworth's house. I said, oh, Gee, they don't have signs going to my house. I was so disappointed to find out he was dead. I was tricked by that shepherd. And I figured I'll pick up one of his books here, a little 50-cent pamphlet or something, and I read it, and it changed my life. That, wow, he's speaking to me. And the poem that he, in particular, was Tintern Abbey. It was a poem about memory, a poem about love, a poem about understanding, and these were things I was just beginning to understand myself as a young man. So Wordsworth, I would say, was very important for me. He had a wife, he had a love of family. He also loved nature. He said nature never did betray the heart that loved her. And what poets lie, you know. He didn't know about deer, ticks, and hurricanes. But Wordsworth influenced me a lot.
When you talk about the influence of men's lives in poetry, you have your top 5 list of poets who have influenced you, and that constantly rotates. But 3 who are often in that top 5 for me are Gwendolyn Brooks, Anne Sexton, and June Jordan. And,
so all women.
They were all women. I mean, I think Anne Sexton's been kind of maligned as this confessional poet, but she was also excellent at her craft. But in terms of giving me permission, June Jordan in particular, in melding the political and the erotic, they were the ones. It wasn't necessarily men who had given me permission to do that, but it was women who had given me permission to do that as a writer.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like your word permissions because I've been married since 1969, and one of the things I'd like to do is write more openly about both my love for my wife and our sensual experiences together. But on one hand, I want to pay homage to the woman I love. On the other, it's like, there is this private relationship that you have, and you don't necessarily want to share it with the whole world. So that poem I wrote about sharing her towel is sort of true. And she sees it as a compliment, but I think there's some other poems I've written about us that still need to stay in the folder for a while.
Well, on that note of sharing, let's open this up to our studio audience, shall we? I think, Rashad, you have a question for one of the gentlemen?
Yes, I do. I actually have a question for all of you that you guys can answer. I wanted to know where you guys like to stand in your poetry. I know that, Mr. Rosal, you said that, there's this scale of weakness, and then there's the high masculinity. So are you somewhere in the middle? Because I know you said you like to write in the middle, but as people, where do you guys stand? Do you know what I mean? I know Mr. Lynch said that you like the idea of equality and having everyone being equal. So how do you help in that situation?
My colleague at where I teach at Bloomfield College she teaches Shakespeare, and she gave me this really neat drawing from the Elizabethan times of the 4 humors. Oh God, I hope I can remember this. Melancholic, phlegmatic, help me out.
Bilious,
choleric.
Those are the 4. Two of them were considered manly. 2 of them were considered quote unquote womanly. But the way that the drawing was made was that the fluids, the humors, flowed into one another. So the Elizabethan idea of gender was actually more fluid than what we have today. We have a much more fixed idea of being of one extreme or the other. And even saying that you're at some fixed point in between somewhere is also a kind of a very strict definition of gender. I like to think that throughout our lives, throughout different phases in our lives, we probably moved somewhere between those 2 extremes. I don't know how to really kind of put it any better than
Do you find that some of your poems are just more butch, and some are more, more sensitive? I mean, is that a fluid voice in your writing as well, as you work through maybe certain situations in it?
It could be. I've never actually used that lens to look at my own work, but it might be.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I'm trying to stand for, to use Rashad's word or phrase, is the idea that people should not be dominant, people should not be submissive, and you can carry that into a variety of contexts. At the same time, I enjoy the idea of being a somewhat assertive male sexually, and there will be poems that celebrate that, but not to the extent that you're putting someone down or controlling someone or repressing someone. That's the person I'd like to be, even at my age. And now I'm 61. I wish I had known these things earlier. I could have written very different poems.
I think Rashad's question is interesting because it brings up the whole idea of the speaker in the poem. Is the speaker the writer? There could be a disjunct there, and in my poems, there sometimes is. I make up a lot of stuff. It's not all, from my life. But also, the speaker doesn't have to be a admirable person for it to be a good poem. In fact, the reverse is sometimes true. We can learn a lot from watching people act out bad things on the stage of the poem, and I think that's as helpful in some ways about learning about human nature.
We just had a fiery English club, creative writing club experience of somebody who wrote a poem about a 17-year-old boy who's going out to basically get lucky. And we talked about, he's very thinking about his needs. And the same thing, but it's a true and honest experience that needs to be voiced.
What do you mean by get lucky? Gamble?
Not quite, no.
We'll tell you after.
I think of Robert Lowell's great poem, Skunk Hour. The speaker of that poem is not likable in a lot of ways. And then at a certain point, about 3/4 of the way of the poem, he says, my mind's not right. And all of a sudden your heart goes out to this person.
Yeah.
So I think all literature, great literature, takes us into experiences that we could not have had, even if it's into the mind and the feelings of a crazy person, or somebody who's experiencing the world in negative ways.
And as a reader and as a writer, because you said you've been writing in a woman's voice, and over a period of time. Have you found that that's changed for you?
I'm doing it probably more, writing from the point of view of other people. I'm working on a series of poems now. The series is called The Man Who Never Was. And The Man Who Never Was a TV show in the 60s, and the main character was named Peter Murphy. I couldn't resist this. And as I've sort of roving my way through the poems, it turns out that this is a guy who's sort of homeless. He has no relationships with other people except as somebody that is abused, is knocked around, is fetches, and that sort of thing. His only encounters with people are where he's very vulnerable, and he always gets the short end of it. So, this is not like my real life, but maybe it's like my emotional life for a good part of my life. I want to comment on something you said earlier about a 17-year-old who wanted to go out and get lucky. I think that's part of the ritual of being a man, going through that phase. But I'm also thinking there's a heck of a lot of 37-year-old men who are going out trying to get lucky. And
now I understand.
Now you understand.
47.
40, well, I was thinking that. 40, and you can keep going, pick a decade. And I think what happens is that's just sad, and I understand it. But, you get lucky when you're 17, but after that, it's more than luck. You need a relationship of some sort. And I guess in the series of poems I'm writing, it's about sort of the opposite, maybe about that guy who's trying to get lucky, has no idea what luck is. He's just sort of wandering around, and he's just trying to get there, get something. That's the American way, let's get.
Yeah. Who is everyone reading? We know who kind of your top 5 are. Can you kind of quickly rattle off who's on your nightstand right now?
I'm reading an anthology called Beyond the Frontier, published maybe 3 years ago, of African American poetry.
Great. Good. Yeah.
I'm reading a book of fiction by Robert Farrow, The Family of Max Desir. It was a novel that came out in the early 80s, and it grabbed me from the first sentence, just with the words.
Do you remember the sentence?
Oh, I don't. It's something about the turn of the road looking like an Arabic letter, but it's a beautiful opening, and it just drew me right in.
Great. Creator?
I've actually started listening to the Odyssey on tape. And it's wonderful. Driving up the Parkway, listening to Aola releasing the winds as my car is getting blown across. and I was into it. And then I got here and the feathers from my coat are spreading all over the place. And I was getting real nervous thinking that one of the gods is going to put me on an island or something. And I hadn't read that book since 1969. And so some of it is very familiar to me, and some of it is like, oh, I don't remember that part. Did they add that?
Are you enjoying it more this time?
I am. I'm probably, because at that point I hadn't read anything. That was probably when I first started reading seriously, and I started with the Odyssey, Allen Ginsberg and the Odyssey. I don't know what I was thinking, but I did. But he wasn't a dead white guy, it was a dead Greek, I guess, or something like that. But it went way back. But I am enjoying it.
Yeah. Great. The anthology that you're reading, that's built around what theme?
Basically, it has a variety of themes. It's edited by E. Ethelbert Miller, and I'm reading it because many of the poets in there have attended Cave Canem, which is a special workshop for black poets, and they're younger than I am, and I wanted to see what kinds of forms and themes they're using.
Great. Alrighty. Well, I think we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be right back with Men's Lives in Poetry. Thank you.
If you're smart, before you cook, you'll sort black beans on a white plate and pick out the stones. If you miss a small porous bead, like the cliffs of Tufa in which old Indians scratched their caves, it might dissolve in your stew and add some positive minerals, but a hard boil means nothing to a dense little stone. It may get into the bag on the table by the hand of a peasant, that pebble, or the hand of a child of a peasant, from the Scrabble of some high and loveless field where there's nothing but rocks to eat. Like the rock that got into my mouth, the stone my father sent me. My father gave me a stone, and I ate it.
Hi, I'm Joan Braley. I'm a Brookdale alumni, and you're watching Brookdale TV.
Oreo. When my Welsh mama died, I was taken in by an aunt who worked for you, who slipped tray after tray of you into cellophane bags she sneaked home to wrap my lunch. Every day you were present in second grade. 2 black eyes punched into the bleached skin of my bologna and mustard sandwich. How can I forgive you what you were? How you troubled me for years until the old man got a new wife who brought home different cookies and made ham and lettuce and mayonnaise and occasionally tomato. I never looked back, though I loved that aunt who took me from nuns that made me eat sweet potatoes, even after I spilled my spew onto the plate and made me eat that too. Sweet potatoes, how bitter, and Oreos with their inner light flickering from 2 dark lids, black and white, slapping me, yelling, eat it all, eat it all.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Writers Series, where our studio audience has been asking questions of our 4 authors. So, yes.
Yes, good evening. My name is Diane Panzer, and I'm a perennial student here at Brookdale. I just love it. And my question is open to all of the panelists. When do you decide that a poem has been revised sufficiently? For example, do you share your work with a mentor at that junction, or a peer, or do you make your own decision?
That's a hard, not a hard question, but a hard thing to work through. I think everybody has people that we trust, you know, who we bring our poems to. But like, I'm working virtually alone now for the first time in 5 years, and it's quite scary. And it really turns you back inside yourself to ask yourself the kind of questions that you would have turned to a mentor to answer. But yeah, I think everybody's got someone that they take their poems to at a certain point. I try to take them pretty late. I don't show like real new work until I feel comfortable about it. But.
I agree exactly. I used to show new work to my mentor, and it became too depressing. And so, you know, I really work it hard, and before I'll show it to anybody. So I think I've changed over that. My standards maybe have gotten higher.
Well, I think also you might be able to look at it yourself and know what your mentor is already going to say and save him or her the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's always possible to really write a bad poem, though, and not know it. And that's the scariest thing to me, is to not realize that you've written something bad.
It's not just possible to write a bad poem and not know it. It's likely. It's probable. I, you know, when I first started writing poetry seriously, one of the things that was really important to me was accessibility. I wanted, you know, like, none of the guys that I grew up with read books or really into poetry or art for that matter, but I wanted to write poems that that challenged them, but they had to have a measure of accessibility to them too, in order for that to happen. I don't do that as much now. I find myself writing poems that are a little bit more difficult to understand, but I still like to read those poems that are a little bit more difficult to understand to people who are not necessarily immersed in the culture of poetry, just to get what their impressions are, however scant they might be.
I'd like to ask, you said, it's easy to write bad poems, and many of the people in the audience are writers, and all of you writers here. What's the ratio? Do you do 1-to-1? Is it 2-to-1? It's just good to hear from people who are publishing. How often do you write bad poems?
I love using this explanation because my book is it's numbered up until page like 61 or something like that. And I asked people how long it's taken. I wrote it from between 1997 and 2003, which is 6 years. On that, if you do the math, that's about 10 pages a year, about a page per month. And I didn't write just a page a month. I was writing almost every day for about 6 years. If I wrote 200 pages a year, 1,200 pages over that period of time, that means about 1,100 pages got knocked out of the manuscript. That's not to say that they were a waste of my time. I call them the invisible uglies. They actually hold the manuscript together. I couldn't have those 60 pages without. They're still there. They're just invisible, and they hold what you're reading together.
Interesting. I tend to revise too much. I wish I were more relaxed with letting a poem go. I often take it through 14 or 15 drafts, being very concerned with sound values, and a lot of times when I read it aloud, I don't even think people respect the fact that I've set it up with these rhythms and rhymes. One of the things I do, though, is I seldom work on the same poem over and over again in sequence. I have folders and different poems in there, and I'll take different ones out at different times, because I often play with voices. I play with black dialect, or I try to imitate, a woman who may work with me, how she may sound. I'm not always sure that I'll take the same poem to the same person, because at times I need a different type of audience even to advise me about revision based upon the voice I'm using.
My name is Dina Ahmed. I'm a student here at Brookdale. I have two very quick questions. The first one is for Mr. Lynch. When you first started writing poetry and between now, what is the difference in context and theme between poems written by males from then to now?
That's not an easy question for me to answer, because I started, Dina, at 8 years old. So, I'm reading quite a few poems that still probably would be in children's literature books. That's about all I can say, because it's been such a long period of writing. I can't necessarily make a comparison very easily or contrast very easily between then and now.
Okay. The second one is for Mr. Donnelly. Between when you were writing before you came out and after you came out, which do you feel was, which kind of poems were you happier with their quality?
There's a famous quote of Paul Monet's, the gay activist, essayist and poet. He says, "Before I came out, clear was the last thing that I wanted to be in my poetry," and I really identified with that when I wrote these very obscure, abstract pieces of crap, really, and I'm much happier with the way I'm writing now, but it's only partly related to coming out. It's also related to just becoming a better writer and practicing a lot. But I do think that it's hard for a person who's hiding a part of themselves to really be an artist of any kind. So.
Great question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Charlene Rosales from student at Brookdale. I noticed that Peter Murphy, you have a line from Janis Joplin's song that's really inspired you. So I want to know if the other poets on the panel have a particular line that has inspired you since you started writing poetry, or even until now, a particular line that might even inspire more than one poem of yours.
Just for reference, the line I wrote in my statement was "Women is losers,"
which was from
Janis Joplin, from a song of the same title, and she worked hard to be a loser.
Is there anything?
I don't know that there's any one thing that I turn to again and again. Probably not in music. I don't work to music when I work, but there are poets that I go back to again and again. Like before I write, I'll try and read myself something that I know is very musical language, and then when I start to read my own work, out loud, if there's no music in the language, I can hear it right away. So it's kind of a good check for me to read Yeats or something, you know, who is like the Bach of poetry. And then if you hear this huge clunking sound when you read your own poem, then you know you have some work to do later that day.
I love to listen to music, and I used to know rhythm and blues very well and could sing it very well when I was younger. So even now sometimes I'll take a poem and pretend that I'm performing it as a song and just see how that would sound if in fact I was performing it. I do this alone, no one else hears me, so it's fun. But at times the disparity between how your voice sounds when you're speaking and how you would say or sing a poem does indicate at times where certain pauses should be, where certain rhythms should be, where you need to speed it up, slow it down. A word like "the," for instance, can really be a clunker in a poem. You can get through it in a song because you can extend it melismatically at times. The reason, that kind of thing. But in a poem, that "the" is a very thudding sound, and you have to discourage that and find an adjective in its place sometimes.
Any other questions?
Yes, Joel Fleming, student at International Playboy.
He should be on the panel.
I think it was Robert Frost who said, writing poetry without rhyme is like playing tennis without a net. Is there any reason that most modern poetry is without rhyme?
Yeah. So the question is there any reason why most modern poetry is without rhyme?
First of all, Frost wrote a lot of unrhymed poetry himself. What I tell my students is two things. One is all the good rhymes have been taken. And if they want to write creative writing, they cannot imitate. So I forbid them to use end rhyme, which is a difference here, end rhyme, unless they're going to do it in a surprising and new way. For example, if we're going to move a hippopotamus, it's going to take an awful lot of us. I do encourage them to use other sound devices, because end rhyme is only one, and it's the one that we most immediately associate with poetry, but there's a whole lot of other sound devices, figures of speech that I try to have my students do, because there are new ways to make what we have been doing for thousands and thousands of years.
I think people respond to that, because in my introduction to lit class, I had a Tony Hoagland poem, a Billy Collins poem, kind of a little poetry simpler that they read, and the response of the students have been, well, these aren't poems, they don't rhyme. Yeah. And I thought exactly that. I'm like, well, look at the interior rhymes and all the rest of it. But I think it's what we get from the crib and what is comfortable, I think, as well, possibly.
The downside of that is everything that rhymes is considered poetry, no matter how trashy or how bad it is, including the popular, Hallmark kind of cards, the instant sentimentality and that stuff. And that has nothing to do with poetry.
Yeah.
And that's the downside of poetry, rhyme, poetry, and rhyme.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think we have time for one last quick question from our audience.
My name is Eddie. I'm also a international student, like my friend Joel. Mine is a practical question, an economic question. Several years ago, James Michener donated money for new poets to be published, and it was a disaster. It did nothing for poetry. Now we have the Lilly millions of dollars that's been given to the poetry magazine. I thought that money should be spent toward in high schools, Mr. Murphy, about encouraging kids to write poetry, which seems to be a void within the system. That English teachers, creative writing teachers are frightened about teaching poetry. Would it be a great idea to do something like that, or do you have any ideas how that millions of dollars should be spent?
If I can just rant for a second, if I want to take painting classes, I would take them from a painter. If I want to take dance classes, I would take them from a dancer. Who teaches writing? English teachers. It's the only art where the people who teach it do not practice it. So I agree wholeheartedly, and I think what I've been reading about that Lilly grant is that the Poetry Foundation is going to try to put a lot of that money into high schools to improve the teaching of poetry. I hope it does. I hope it works. I hope it doesn't become a curse.
Also, $100 million is relatively little money. I mean, when you think about the amount of money that goes into sports or making a Hollywood film or all of that, I mean, it's big numbers in relative terms.
Perhaps a war in Iraq.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. How much money has been wasted. I think it's great. We can argue about whether Ruth Lilly ought to have spread her money around in a different way, but I think it's gotten people's attention in a good way.
I think there's always something more you could do with it, or more money that that you want to spread?
Of economics, three of you are teachers, and you've taught as well, and our editor working in publishing. Are there other things that male poets can do other than teach or edit? How do you work that into your life if you're not going to go teach or you're not going to go publish?
I think there's two questions there. Many of us teach because we get to stay close to language and things like that. But there are many poets out there, many of whom who are not known, but some who are widely published, like Louis Jenkins, who is a guard at a museum somewhere in Minnesota, I think. Right? I don't think that there's necessarily a career that's attached to being a poet, though teaching has become one of those, and I forgot what the other idea was.
You know what, on that note, I think we're going to have to close out. I would like to thank Pat Rosal, Peter Murphy, Pat Donnelly, and Charles Lynch for being on the Brookdale Writers Series, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This part's real. The kid sways near a curb. The club's fuck-hard flash of neon lights keeps time inside. His top lip split, mouth popped into hell-glow blossom, eyes swelled shut like peaches. Small, half as dark and twice as yapping drunk as you, he swings forward and lands a clean right cross, you confused with a good reason to try and toss him like a sack of trash into the midnight traffic. His Pinay girlfriend, so light-skinned and round-eyed, she would have passed for Magellan's daughter, shouts, "You goddamn monkey!" in perfect English, which makes you hold his head in your hands without thinking of his mother cursing in Tagalog. When you thrust one more time the tender cartilage of his nose against your knee, except this story isn't about you. It's about me. And every time someone's bar buzz crescendos to mezzo forte tough guy, maybe I should consider that kid holding both arms out as if he'd catch whatever he could summon from the sky. But rage doesn't work like that. It's like this. I race down the parkway and skip every exit I know too well, slumped in the driver's seat for the next 100-odd half-dreamed miles, taking turns sucking my bloody knuckle with the only girl I think I'll ever kiss. My tongue too dumb to tell which taste belongs to whom and which mouth happens when.
Under the pantry, our pretend cave stowed used books, ladder, sawhorse, rake. Whitewashed rendezvous we scampered from, bandana mask, 6 shooters drawn, to stick up screamy hopscotch gals. Across frontiers, 2 boys delve their little men. Smoke signals rise. Shh. Nosy neighbors. Coast unclear. Will sad children testify? Long legs teeter fly-strewn net between dusty coiled black holes and Van de Velde's mildewed manual of sex. Amicable settlement did not cease dazed picking at my chafed lip or cure chronic eavesdrop to collect the how and when of crumbling home. Scandalized couple strove to lay to rest tumult of their parents' stress. Courtroom's massive doors burst wide. So, Aunt Sarah, what they rule me and Boop supposed to do? Big top clown in raggedy drawers? Survive best on community's chest? Stash lawns microchips for gold? Run away in a hideout till the cold? No cause to split your brothers up. Your parents love you very, very much. It's just they cannot get along. School year with one, summer the other. Father, rip my soul by half. Spare this child who spanked the rod. Private parts forbidden to strut. Won't compete. Will be middling or effete. A wobbly top that rests its spin from under mama's master thumb may only gauge a whip hand brash to deem its axis is foretold by gutsy men unlike myself. loom of blood breaking bed, blot of ancestry, rattled kin. Do scabs of memory heal us whole?
Prayer at the opera. I had already been weeping quietly for half an hour at the Academy of Music by the time Ulysses finally made it home, disguised as a beggar. He was begging for his son to recognize him, to know him, and the boy longed to, but a whole kingdom hung on this, and he was afraid to love a fraud. When the Croatian baritone stretched out his hand to the boy, quivering thin and lonely on the other side of the stage, and sung his name softly, Telemaco, Telemaco, mio diletto. It was as if the floor of the world tilted the boy into his arms. And because I thought I heard my father calling, I thought all voices were my voice, begging you, who made it easy for me to weep. Lend the gift of tears to a man my mother said cried 2 times when Kennedy was shot and at my birth.
The God nobody wanted. The heart's ambition is to love. That much is clear. But what else? Look at history. Look at your own life, how you have spent it, what you own. How has wealth changed you, the ones you love? What will it say on your tombstone other than consumer? Have you thought about altruism and ants and wondered when they will replace us? Have you spent any time looking for what you could not see, like Galileo or Copernicus or Luther? Do you know the Buddhists have a sutra that foreshadows the Sermon on the Mount? Another, the prodigal son. Have you heard of the Upanishads? What religion were the Magi? Where did your God go after Darwin, after Einstein? All right, not after Einstein, but after Auschwitz, after Nagasaki. Is he still there? In which language does he speak to you? Does he repronounce himself in the Book of Mormon, the Wall Street Journal? Has he opened a dollar store in a strip mall? Or has he been replaced by a technological imperative? If it can be done, it must be done. Maybe your God still listens to you like a stethoscope to bad air. Or maybe he's busy swapping DNA in the protein of the colored bodies of chromosomes. Perhaps placebo surgery has kept him recovering in another century. No matter what you say, you're only talking about yourself. And did you know the word pontiff means bridge, linking what to what, I don't know, as fathers stumble from parish to parish, one kneeling boy to the next, while forgiving each other's sins. Is this what Meister Eckhart meant when he wrote, I pray God to deliver me from God? That's about right. In the end, we're food for worms who have no higher aspiration than to pass through the earth as the earth passes through them. An earth richer for their digestion, beautiful, nurturing humus on the other side.